Mike Pearson, who's with us, and Pearson Ecological has been leading site assessments at 26 different sites, the high priority sites, over the past 3 years. And this will be the first time that results from all those will be showed off. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike right now. Mike, it's all you.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Let me just get organized here. Okay, good morning. So we see the monitoring, the effectiveness, of course, these sites, you learned only 2 of them have been constructed, one just a couple of months ago. So what we've been doing really is baseline monitoring. We're getting the current conditions, what's happening at these sites. And that's very important because without that, we can't really judge how effective they are after they're built. You can only do that by comparing what the conditions were beforehand. That seems like kind of a no-brainer, but I'm actually very excited by this project because baseline monitoring is almost never done, let alone 3 years of it. So we've got an excellent foundation for figuring out exactly how effective this work has been. The field work's been pretty intensive. Over the 3 years, our crews have been in the field more than 250 days. We did fish sampling at 18 of the sites. Most of those were sampled 3 times each year. So before freshet in March and April, during the high water period, generally May and June, and then post freshet between July and September. And this was done just because conditions are quite different, both inside and outside the dikes in each of these time periods. Won't spend much time on the map, but the little pink dots are the ones that we did the sampling at. There's sort of 2 general groups, sort of the upriver sloughs. This is Zaskalachen Slough at Lacamo Territory in Nikuman Island. And they are sort of the flood infrastructure. Its operation is driven in these sites more by freshet. There's very little in tidal action up here. It's just too far upriver. The elevation's just a little too high. And then further downriver, of course, and the estuary, sort of from Mission downstream, is the boundary roughly. And here the habitats are highly tidal. This are some pictures from Tilbury Slough, where the tide is several meters per day. And so conditions change, certainly outside the dike and often inside the dike on an hourly basis in these systems. There's a variety of methods to capture fish. That's partly because all methods for capturing fish are selective. They will catch more of some species than of others. Those differ between the different types. And some methods can be used or can't be used in some habitats. For instance, you can't use the seines in areas where there's a lot of obstructions in the water. You just snag the nets and it doesn't work. So we use funnel traps everywhere. So these are G traps, and then the larger fetish traps that we make. You can see in the top right photo there. These are baited with chum salmon roe set overnight. We try and set at least 10 of each type inside the dike and 10 outside the dike, depending, and sometimes much more than that. The seines we use, as they say, where we can, where conditions permit. They're very effective and when conditions are good, and especially for catching some juvenile salmon like Chinook and chum that rarely venture into traps for some reason. In the tidal areas, we also use a fyke net. And that's the bottom picture there. And the way that works is you can see it's kind of got lead nets, and then you can probably make out there's a cylinder or a barrel in the middle. It's I don't know, probably 6 to 8 feet long, a couple of meters. And the way it works is we set it at high tide, and then in a relatively narrow tidal channel. And then as the tide goes out, and fish are swimming downstream with the current, it basically filters them out of the water. So these, again, can be very effective in tidal streams. And one set at Addington Point, we caught over 16,000, mostly stickleback, in one set in that net. We use data loggers to track conditions of water quality. So the top, that little blue one's a temperature logger. They're quite inexpensive, and we use them at all of the sites. The bottom one, well, the very bottom one's a pen for scaled, and then that black logger in the bottom is a water level logger. So it's a pressure sensor that will record water pressure, which then we can convert into water depth. And so that's particularly useful at the tidal sites and to figure out how much freshet is impacting the site. So we use those at quite a few sites. And then the largest one there is an oxygen logger, which are prohibitively expensive, like $2,500 a pop. So we don't use those everywhere. We have 4 of them, and we use them when we're sampling. We strap them into our larger traps and set them at key locations for a couple of days while we're sampling. So that gives us sort of oxygen profiles, usually for a couple of days, at each of those 3 periods that we're sampling: pre-freshet, freshet, and post-freshet at all of the sites. And that's important. We also measure oxygen, temperature, and specific conductivity, which gives us a general index of pollution levels at each trap site. But the oxygen readings for those spot measurements can actually be quite misleading. And I'll show you a graph later on to illustrate that. Because when the biologists are out there measuring it during the day, oxygen can appear quite fine, but then depending on conditions may go close to 0 at night. Particularly if there's a big algae bloom, because the algae is producing oxygen during the day, but consuming it at night, so it drives these big swings in oxygen. Fish, of course, need oxygen all the time, so it's very important for us to figure out if there's none in the middle of the night. During the field work, we worked with guardians and representatives of First Nations and whoever's core territory the structure we were working on in. At Lacamo, one of the studies, it was just a fun and interesting version of that. They had a youth program last year. This year as well, we're working with them. And they came into the field with us to do the sampling. And it's one of the things that I feel really good about with the Resilient Waters program in general, is this connection with the nations, where we're working on the water with them on a daily basis. And that, I think, improves our work through gaining local knowledge and perspectives, Indigenous perspectives, and also really improves the communication, so that their folks are seeing firsthand what's happening as it's happening and have that information. Some generalities. We find, I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics. You can imagine I've got 15 minutes, and 18, 20 sites and 250 field days, there's not going to be a ton of detail. But in general, we found invasive species much more prevalent behind dikes and than outside them. And water quality is poor behind the dikes, and that changes seasonally. So let's see. This is Casey. A second, I'm gonna have to deal with my cat here. My apologies. Just trying to run the show. So this is Casey Marsh. And at this location, we measured, this is an oxygen logger. So that top panel in the graph, the blue line that waves a little bit, this is in early spring, that's oxygen. The yellow line down below it is just kind of a threshold. So if the oxygen level dips below the yellow line, that's indicating that it's stressful for fish. If it dips below the red line, a lot of them are probably going to die. The lower panel is water temperature. And there, that black line at the bottom is the actual water temperature being measured over a couple of days. And then again, the yellow line above it, if the temperature goes above that, it's going to be stressful for fish. If it goes above the red line, some monids at least are likely to die. And you can see in early spring, everything's fine. The oxygen's way higher than stressful levels, temperature much lower. So conditions are quite good. During the freshet period, so May and June, it's already deteriorated. The temperature is still fine. You can see it's still well below the stressful levels, but the oxygen levels, particularly at night, are dropping below the stressful level. So the fish are getting stressed for some part of the day. And then later in the summer, sort of July through September, it gets a little ugly. So there, the temperature, interestingly, in this location, close to the mountain, is still fine. But the oxygen is below the lethal level most of the 24-hour period. It just peaks above it during the sunny afternoons, basically. And so that is very typical of, not universal, nothing is in these sites, but very typical of what we find, where in the spring everything's fine, and then relatively quickly as spring advances and early summer, things start to deteriorate, and by late summer inside the dike, conditions are very bad for fish. In the tidal sites, there's, as I said, the tides have an enormous impact over hours. These are those same kinds of graphs. So here you can see oxygen. This is in July of 2021. And so during high tides, oxygen is high, just fine for salmon, and temperature is low, relatively low. It's borderline stressful in July, but still quite tolerable. But when the tide goes out, the water's shallow, it warms up very quickly, and the oxygen depletes of it, partly because of warm water holds less oxygen, and partly because of the decomposing material in there has more of an effect on the low water volume. So now the salmonids survive this just fine. So this is in Addington Point, and during the high tides, we'd be catching salmonids inside. So they ride the tides in, forage in these highly productive habitats, and then ride the tide out before water quality conditions get bad for them. Conversely, we find that the invasive species don't do well in these conditions. As soon as the tide's in, because the salmon are moving all the time, right? They're in here on their way migrating out to the ocean. So, and you might think of it, for a salmon, this is more like an airport, right? It's a place that they pop in on their journey, grab a bite to eat, have a little rest, and then get back on their journey. where the invasive species are trying to live in there all the time. And so when oxygen and particularly temperature, because the invasive species almost all prefer warmer water, when that temperature is going up and down and the oxygen levels on an hourly basis, it makes it very hard for them. So we find very fewer of them. The fish passage varies widely among structures, as we would expect. Sort of manual gates, which are rare, are open all the time, offer free passage, and you generally find that fish communities inside and outside the dike are quite similar. Side-mounted gates, like the ones at McLennan Creek here, shown here, are also quite good, where, and you see relatively similar fish communities inside and outside the dike, at least close to the dike. As you get further inland, there's often more water quality problems and things change. And the top mounted gates, it typically very different, right? Outside, we could be catching Chinook and chum and, predominantly native fish. Inside, it's typically mostly invasives. The lesson for the salmonids, or the coho and Chinook anyway, is that these habitats support fish from over a lot of British Columbia. So in the map on the left of British Columbia, every yellow dot there is the birthplace of Chinook salmon that we caught in the Fraser Valley using these habitats. Outside, or sometimes even inside the dikes. So you can see there, some of those are as far north as Fort St. James, right? And the map on the right shows it for coho, where we've got one from Chilco Lake area, Merritt, all over the place. So just to underline that we're not just talking about local fish in terms of the value of these habitats. It's much bigger than that. Other things that we find are able to document impacts. This is McLennan Creek at Matsqui. And in 2023, if you may recall, the freshet came incredibly early. So the gates closed, the pumps were on before a lot of the coho left these systems. And the picture on the right, taken by Merle Coffin, one of the Matsqui Guardians, it's hard to make out, but those red circles are dead coho on the rocks that have gone through the pump. Through the monitoring work, we were able to identify restoration opportunities. One of the more unexpected ones was at Mariah Slough at Seabird Island. Because I think most of you know that there was a major landslide at the north end of Seabird Island in the November 2021 floods, shown here. What was surprising was that the creek that's now flowing through this landslide, it formerly went out directly to the Fraser River. The landslide diverted it into the top end of Mariah Slough, which for years has gone completely dry in late summer. To our surprise, that creek going into the upper end of Mariah Slough is now allowing the upper end to support salmonids. In 2022, there was high densities of coho up there, again in habitat that have been dry for years in summer. Coho haven't made it up since then because there's barriers that the November 2021 floods allowed them past, but they were not able that. They weren't able to in subsequent years, but there's still cutthroat up there. KWL is now working with the band, with Seabird to improve conditions there and ensure that there's a permanent connection down into the rest of the slough. This is Backwash Slough at Chiam, where we've, one of the things we found with the genetic work was that in off-channel ponds that are isolated through the winter, we were finding coho. And genetic work showed that these were endangered, a lot of them were endangered interior coho. So they're coming down through the canyon. We find these at some of these upriver sites. And it's overwintering in the valley where conditions are gentler before heading out. So one of the designs that we've been working with Chiam on is both reconnecting Backwash Slough, which is completely isolated, this section, but also digging, or planning to dig a series of channels and small pools that we can complex with wood that will hold water all winter long to create more space for these overwintering coho. I won't belabor Agassiz Slough. We, other than to say that we were able to confirm its success. And it was completed in 2021 and 2022 for the first time, probably since prior to 1948, coho salmon overwintered in there. If you do want the details of particular sites, you can get them on the Resilient Waters website. We've got baseline monitoring report cards that summarize the data for each of these sites over the 3 years of baseline monitoring. With that, I'd just like to thank all that helped us in the field. Our staff at Pearson Ecological, Watershed Watch, KWL, and all of the nations that we've had the privilege of working with. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, really great details. Feel free to pop in any questions for Mike in